According to our guest, Josh Larsen, films and faith have been intertwined in my head since childhood. As a practicing film critic, I hope to encourage other Christians in a nuanced, aesthetically focused, and theologically rooted exploration of the art of cinema. So his book, Movies Are Prayers, explores how modes of prayer, praise, confession, lament, are modeled by all types of films. In this fashion, Josh's book illuminates the richness of both cinema and prayer. I know you will love this conversation that I had today with Josh on the Unhurried Living Podcast. As I was preparing for my conversation with Josh today, of course I wanted to stay on topic on this idea of movies are prayers, which I can't wait for you to hear how he unpacks that. But you know me, I really wanted to dig into character arcs as well and the transformational aspect of a person within a movie. So we talked about that. We talked about a lot of different things. Before we move into our actual conversation, let me tell you just a little bit about Josh. He's the co-host of the podcast Film Spotting. He's also the editor of Think Christian, a digital magazine on faith and culture. So Josh has influenced the minds of moviegoers on the applicability of stories to real life, spirituality, and faith for years. You can read Josh's movie reviews at his website, larsenonfilm.com. And he lives near Chicago with his beautiful family. So, why don't we just go ahead and get to it? Here's my conversation with Josh Larsen. So, Josh Larsen, welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I saw this, the title of your book, which we'll get to in a minute, float by on my Instagram feed whenever it came out, 2 years ago, I think. And I was intrigued. So it's about time I got on here and started talking to you. But of course, we have to start with kind of what's going on in the world right now with the coronavirus. And I just got a note from our assistant. She has now been told to shelter in place for 30 days. That's in Kansas.
Okay.
So how are you doing with all of that?
I'm feeling relatively fortunate for my, personal situation. I live outside of Chicago. So obviously, Chicago, densely populated city. It seems to be all projections are that things will become even more serious in the coming days around here. But our neighborhood is relatively calm. Our two kids are at home. We have an 8th grader and a senior. And so e-learning is in place. My wife is a school librarian. So e-book reading to the kids is in place. And most of my work is remote and digital already. So that hasn't been too disrupted beyond adjusting the family rhythm. So feeling good, but, also realizing there are a ton of folks out there who are in more difficult situations, especially in terms of how employment is affected and health, of course. So there's a lot going on. How about you? Well, how are you doing?
Actually, we're kind of similar to you. Our children are grown. They're in their 20s. We do have 2 of them still with us. But one of them is now working from home. The other one is now doing college work from home. And Alan and I have a home office. So in a lot of ways, we're not that unsettling to us physically.
Yeah.
It's more the emotional for me that I have my own, fears and anxieties that come up like everybody has. But don't you think we're also feeling just the collective stress?
Yes.
Of the people, you can kind of feel it as an overlay. So I feel like I have to breathe deeper to get, to calm myself down.
And that's the double-edged sword of things like social media. And even what we're doing is that it's good to connect. It's good to have that social interaction that we would otherwise not be able to enjoy. But that's also where a lot of the collective anxiety comes flooding in. So one challenge is to be aware, informed, for me at least, because it seems like what seems like the right decision changes almost daily.
Yes.
So you want to keep up with what, the experts are suggesting, but that also does open the gateway for the anxiety of others as well. So yeah, it's difficult on that end. But again, also just fortunate that it's that sort of psychological difficulties, at least at this point, we're immediately facing in our house, and just thinking about and praying for those who are in different situations.
That's right. Yeah. And even though we're recording this today, I don't think it's going to air for maybe a month or so. My guess is this will still be a part of our conversations, because like you said, every day some new announcement is happening.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because, the podcast, one of the podcasts I'm involved in, Think Christian, we're trying to be mindful of that as well. We usually have a 1 to 2 week gap between recording and airing.
Yeah.
And the way news is moving so quickly, you do have to realize when you post an episode, let's think about what we said and what it means for this immediate reality, because it does change. And again, those who seem to know the most and have studied this the most I think your projection is right. We're going to be certainly still dealing with this in a couple of weeks.
We are. Well, we wanted to make sure to acknowledge this because we are all carrying an extra load. But like you and like us, most of us are trying to carry on with the work that we do. And here at Unhurried Living, we encourage Christian leaders to lead from that center place of relationship with Jesus. And by unhurried, again, our listeners have heard us say this a million times. We're not talking about everybody moving slow and being slow and doing less necessarily, but we are talking about what is presence. What are practices that you put in place to have, if you want to call it, a balanced life, or at least a rhythmed or patterned life. So there's input and output for sustainability. So I was excited to talk to you about this Movies as Prayers, because that's one of the things is there's always a way to be in connection with God. And so why don't we just go back to maybe your beginnings, your love for movies. Somehow you became a movie critic. How far back does that go? How did this become a career for you?
Well, I can credit / blame probably growing up in a movie-loving household. My parents both really enjoyed films, and we would go as a family to movies all the time. Kind of one of the markers, it seems to me, looking back, is that if we went somewhere, I remember a family vacation when I was young to Toronto, never had been there before. Again, grew up outside of Chicago. And for some reason, my parents thought, well, we're on vacation, but we're still going to go see, I think it was Star Trek 4 or something like that. Even though we could have done that back home, and we maybe that time would have been better spent seeing something specific to Toronto. It was so embedded in our family rhythms that, no, this is what we want to do on vacation. So looking back, that's, other families would say that's a little odd, but so yeah, I was fortunate enough to be in a family like that, and also a family of faith. So a place where those two things were not in conflict from a young age. And that's not to say my parents weren't discerning about what I could and couldn't watch. We were the only house on the block that didn't have MTV, and so they made those sorts of decisions. But it wasn't out of fear. It was more out of discernment than this position that movies or art in general was something we needed to be afraid of. So yeah, it started when I was quite young, and obviously something about movies particularly connected with me. And I became probably the biggest fanatic in the family as I got older. In school, I enjoyed probably the classes I gravitated towards most were writing, English and writing. And so as I started to get old enough to read movie reviews, it just seemed like this perfect confluence. I enjoyed writing, and there were people getting paid to review movies, to write about them. So, naive enough at that young age to think you could just get whatever job you wanted. So I thought, I'm going to go for that one.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I'm glad that calling came together for you. You're throwing me back to my past. I have 2 first movie memories.
Okay.
Our family actually didn't go to a lot of movies. I didn't start going to movies till I was a teenager and could drive around and go myself and go see them. But I do remember seeing a movie when I was probably in 3rd grade, and I think it was maybe Snow White. It was one of those Disney cartoons. But
Sure.
The thing I remember about that experience actually is that my dad got pickpocketed while we were in the movie. And the big story is that, you can't trust people in those movies. And because when we walked out of the movie without my dad's wallet, that's all I remember about that.
Oh, no. Like someone sitting next to him?
I don't even know. When you're a kid, what was I, 8? I just remember the big family story is that we went to a theater and we got pickpocketed. So I don't know if that's why we didn't go to movies, but one of my first movies as a teenager that I remember, of course, is Indiana Jones, the first one, I think, because the faces are melting.
Oh, sure. Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm sorry. What did I just say? Yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
That's Indiana Jones. You're right. Yep.
I watched it like this,
Yes.
But movies are embedded. I mean, that was when I was a teenager. And I can still feel that feeling that I felt by being taken on that ride.
Yeah.
And I love this idea. Again, I saw your book float by on IVP, and it's called Movies Are Prayers. And over the course of my adult life, as I've watched movies, I've sort of felt that, like there's something going on here that's changing me or moving me or drawing me.
Yeah.
But I never worded it like that. So I'm wondering, can you share with us how you came upon that? Why did you write this book? What are you hoping for us?
Yeah, it was kind of born out of experience, similar to what you're saying, is sitting in films and realizing that what I was feeling or experiencing or the way I was thinking paralleled occasional moments either in church or in private prayer when I would be expressing certain things. And, this has been, as you said, probably something that I've sensed in one way or another my whole life. That's maybe one of the reasons movies really did connect with me at a young age so strongly. But particularly, I remember 2011, a film called The Tree of Life was released, directed by Terrence Malick. And it stars Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain. They're a mother and father in 1950s Texas raising 3 young kids. That's the basic story, but it kind of encompasses, goes all the way back to the beginning of creation and involves a lot of the book of Job. And at any rate, there's this extended creation sequence that travels from the beginning of time to, the creation of the earth, to animals coming about. And it's about a 9 to 11 minute sequence. And I remember sitting in the screening room as that was washing over me and just feeling as if Genesis, the book of Genesis itself, was kind of washing over me. And then this immense awe and gratitude over creation. So a thankfulness and something similar to what you would feel as you are praying some of the Psalms of praise, or just prayers of praise you would offer, or even to take it out of, a liturgical setting. If you ever went on a hike and just became awed by nature around you and found yourself almost instinctively offering some sort of expression of praise for that, recognizing your own humility, your own smallness, and that there is someone far greater behind this, giving it as a gift. And so again, aligning those experiences while sitting in a movie theater made me realize, okay, these movies are in some way functioning as prayer. And then it became more of a project. Let's see if I can identify that in other ways. Let's see if I can identify that in other forms of prayer. So are there prayers of confession? Could a movie be a prayer of confession? Could a movie be a prayer of obedience? All these sorts of categories or genres of prayer. And it would kind of fall into place and say, yeah, certain movies can function on our behalf in this way.
Yeah. I like that idea of being open to a movement within yourself and how that can become a kind of prayer, and letting the imagery and the story move you to that. Not everyone thinks to do that. Don't you think that it's,
Yeah, I think there's probably a little tentativeness about that too. And there's the worry about the sacred secular divide maybe, and giving over too much power to something that, and we can maybe get into this, but that didn't intend to offer that prayer. Kind of an underlying principle of my book is that these filmmakers don't always, in the case of Terrence Malick and The Tree of Life, that's a deeply Christian movie, but not all the movies I write about are. So this isn't always what the filmmakers intended, but I still feel because film is an art form, it can become an entity of its own beyond the people who made it and serve these purposes. So back to your question, we're much more comfortable allowing church liturgy to speak on our behalf, and rightly so. But when we think about other forms of art doing that, maybe there's a bit of tentativeness around that.
Yeah, I've had connections with different kinds of art over my life. First of all, I love a good metaphor. I love a good story. So I'm drawn in. Nature, of course, does that for me. But an art gallery or, or the beach. I've had connections with God in cathedrals around the world, museums. So maybe some people have more of a proclivity to that than others. But I think that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because if someone hasn't allowed themselves yet to open to God in these ways where maybe an emotion that you've been denying or suppressing could get raised, and then you could become unafraid to bring that into the presence of God.
Yeah, I think that's part of it for me. Is I'm a pretty reserved guy, and my church tradition is very reserved. So it's it can be, the default can kind of be to tamp down those emotions.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can be surprised when a movie kind of jostles them out of you.
Yeah.
And if you're not that type of person, hopefully you can be appreciative that you had that experience that you might not have allowed yourself to have.
Yeah. Yes. And even more so these days, as we're talking about this collective anxiety that we're feeling, I've been personally encouraging people to make sure they're checking in with their feelings and then sharing them with a trusted person, because we've got to be not in denial.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, for sure.
So anyway, as a spiritual director, one of the things I love is discovering and musing underlying meanings. Like I said, I love a good metaphor. I love the process of transformation. I love watching someone over time gain new insights, make choices, and change. And those through lines are parts, my favorite parts of movies. It does, and it goes across genre. You can find a good character arc even in sci-fi, right?
Sure.
So, but that's what makes it fun. So let's talk a bit about how movies can help us move along in our own journey of change and transformation. Does anything come to your mind for that?
Yeah, I think of, a character arc, you're right, is such a crucial element of good storytelling, that so many films are built around that. And a lot of times for me, it doesn't even have to be a dramatic action or change that a character makes or takes, but sometimes it's just an epiphany that they have.
Yeah.
A moment of self-realization or awareness, and that can represent, if it's not directly about this, represent an awareness of their position in relation to God. And one of the movies that I think that I write about in the book that has an interesting character arc and transformation along this way is Field of Dreams.
Oh, yeah.
Number of years ago now, but sort of a beloved baseball movie. Yeah. Kevin Costner as the farmer in Iowa who hears this message, this voice that tells him, if you build it, they will come, and goes ahead and, instead of corn, builds a baseball field. And much to the consternation of his wife and his farmer neighbors, he's going to lose all of that crop, and he himself is doubtful, but he continues to believe in that voice.
Yeah.
And the voice returns, and as the movie goes on, it suggests other things that he should do as well. And he obeys. And so I did include this as in the chapter of movies as prayers of obedience, because this farmer obeys, but the transformation part comes near the end after he's done all of this, and these baseball players from the past have seemed to come from beyond the grave to play baseball. He's kind of waiting, this farmer's kind of waiting for his reward, right? If you remember the movie.
Yes.
And there's that point near the end where the baseball players leave. They go off into the cornfield, and the implication is, maybe they were in some sort of purgatory. Now they're going to heaven. And Ray, the farmer, wants to go with them, and they tell him, you can't. And his question, I believe he says, if I remember it exactly, is what's what's in it for me? Some variation of that. I've done everything I had to do, but what's in it for me? I want my reward. And one of the baseball players played by Ray Liotta just confronts him and says, is that why you did all this, to get something back? And, for me, I include it as a prayer of obedience, because a Christian understanding of obedience is not that slot machine mentality where you put something in to get something out. Christian obedience is first an act of gratefulness for what we've already been given. And thankfulness for that, and a way of living in faith in response to that. So obeying out of response, not in hope of reward. And to see that click for Ray Kinsella, is one of the truly spiritual, and I would argue deeply Christian metaphors at work in Field of Dreams.
Oh yeah. For me, the word that comes to mind as you're describing this, because I've seen that movie a handful of times, of course, because I love it.
Okay, good.
I just think of the word healing, because it's been so long now. If we give spoilers at this point, that's okay, right? Because hasn't it been out since the 90s?
Yeah, the window is passed on this.
Okay, so it's not like The Sixth Sense and we're going to blow it for people.
Yes.
But I think of healing because right after that, his dad shows up in the field, and Ray Liotta's character says, if you build it, he will come. And it was, his dad. And I just think there's something so beautiful about the healing, whatever that was, of who was real and who wasn't real, and, all that. But the journey he took to get to that place of whatever healing he needed with his own dad.
Yeah.
I loved that, because that went way down into the central space of that character.
Yeah. And that's, another really rich theme of that movie is that reconciliation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the one that has struck a chord with most audiences and why it's lasted so long. It's, it's kind of considered one of the great, father-son, but you could also say, father-daughter, parent-child relationship movies, right?
Totally. So I think that's a really easy movie to probably do what we're talking about here, right? Let it move you. Again, not everybody thinks this way, but could you let yourself consider that there's a relationship in your life that maybe needs some deep healing, and you don't have to follow the steps of Ray Kinsella,
right?
But certainly the idea of what he did, there's this inner voice, and then you're taking steps to do the next thing, and the story starts to unfold.
Taking risks too, right?
Yes, and then ultimately, ideally, at some point, you can never guarantee how long it will take, but there is that healing moment, which I think is such a great resolution for people, because you want that, right? Don't you want?
Absolutely. Yeah. It has a great cathartic element to it. Field of Dreams.
It really does. I love that. I love that one. So there's a couple of phrases of quotes here that come early in your book. I want to read these phrases and talk about this on page 7. So you say, prayer can be expressed by anyone and take place anywhere, even in movie theaters. And then there's this phrase from Richard Foster who says, countless people, you say, pray far more than they know. And then you come back in, you say, movies offer these sorts of unconscious prayerful gestures, only much louder and on a giant screen. So I was wondering if we could talk for a bit about this everywhere prayer. Richard Foster says, we're praying more than we know.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do movies help us with that?
This goes back to one of the fundamental assumptions of the book, which maybe not everyone would agree with, but it's considering a baseline definition of prayer as being any expression that anyone offers that kind of asks two basic questions. What is this place? And what am I doing here? And those are questions you could say even someone who might identify as atheist asks of themselves. And it's something that just kind of comes bubbling out in a time of crisis, existential crisis. And the reason I would say I call that prayer is because we believe in a God who hears and hears every one of us, no matter, who we might claim to be or identify as. And so if you believe in a sovereign God like that, a God who is listening and hears that sort of expression, to me, you've got a prayer. You've got prayer going on. Now, it's absolutely a different type of prayer than, a committed believer might offer over many years. So I'm not equating it that way, but I do think this is sort of, a baseline understanding of how movies can be interpreted as prayers. So maybe another category, another chapter in the book is movies as prayers of yearning. And I think this encompasses, and I talk a lot about sci-fi movies here, this encompasses those people who probably would not identify as religious or even spiritual, but still have these same questions and are searching and seeking. And so the movies that do that searching and seeking can echo their own searching and seeking. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with the Foster quote, and kind of trying to widen the tent there for people to understand that they probably have been praying. And the movies can pray alongside them. Now, at the same time, as we were just talking about, a prayer of obedience is not something someone's really going to offer unless they have committed themselves to a life of faith. And so that is a much more specific, I don't know, I guess you could say orthodox type of prayer than a prayer of yearning. But they're all prayers nonetheless.
Yeah, I actually love the idea of the prayer of yearning. When I was making a list for you of movies from your book that I had seen and could remember enough to have a chat about, I noticed that 3 of them were yearning. So I think that says something about me.
Possibly, yeah.
I do have a yearning, and as you're talking about this, maybe a greater purpose, especially in those sci-fi characters. This something that is within you that you hope is true, but you don't know. I think I actually do have that sense of yearning for that to grow and manifest. Don't you think most of us have that, whatever that is inside?
Oh yeah. I'm glad you say that, because I guess it could have sounded like I was saying, if you are a believer, if you are a Christian, then you won't have prayers of yearning, and that's absolutely not true. So, I think they just take a different shape, have a more specific direction, and have a more vibrant hope to them. But that doesn't mean we're not asking those same questions, and in cases having some of the same doubts. And so you can watch a film, a sci-fi film about yearning that's exploring, and maybe it's not going to resonate with you as a Christian, as someone who is maybe at the very beginning of their journey and asking some of the more very basic questions. But it's also going to possibly speak to you as someone who, feels, as I think every Christian should. We're not given every answer. We're given many, and we have faith and hope in them. But there's still going to be times of confusion and questioning and yearning as well. So I'm glad you made that distinction.
Yeah. And there is a movie that's coming to my mind here. We don't have to go deep into this one. I just want to actually talk about one scene from it, because to me, it's the iconic scene of the entire movie. And that's The Matrix. So again, not a deep dive, but as you're talking about this yearning, or as I brought it up, I guess, the scene in the first one where Neo finally steps into who he is, and he's standing in that hallway, and is it Agent Smith? Is that his name?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and there's all these bullets coming, and Neo, the whole room bends. He puts up his hand, all the bullets stop and fall to the ground. To me, that's an iconic scene of someone who finally, we just left out the whole movie. I understand. But again, this happened in the 90s, so a long time ago. But even just a scene like that I have a freeze frame of it in my mind. And sometimes I will refer to it as a reality that I need in my life right now. So in reality, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, there is this kind of way in which whatever these bullets are that are coming at me may or may not be the last word. And whatever, hand of faith I can put up there, there's a way in which it could fall. So I guess I'm bringing that up because there's movies do that. There's this picture that's painted, and you can use it in your life to get some strength or courage or something.
Absolutely. And you're finding that meaning in that image based on who you are, what your experience has been.
Right.
And it makes me think of, you mentioned going to an art gallery or a museum and having similar experiences. I think we're more open to, say, an abstract painting, someone going in front of it and saying, oh, this, to me, this is what this means. And that's all based in your own psychology and history and beliefs, right? And that's accepted. And the same things can happen where you can sit in front of that scene for the Matrix and it speaks to you in that way. The imagery itself. And I love that you're focusing on the aesthetic details, because I try to do a lot of that in the book, not just story or theme, but also the filmmaking. So I love that you're talking about specific images and finding resonance in them. And that scene, I think that's a great reading of it. I've written about, actually last year was the 20th anniversary of The Matrix, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I wrote about it for Think Christian, and revisiting it, it struck me as just this wonderful metaphor for finding freedom in Christ, and freedom from sin. In Neo, kind of having like all the scales fall away, the easy life, the life that everyone else takes, is not the true life, and he chooses truth. And it's more difficult. Life outside the Matrix is more difficult, but it leads to great freedom. And that scene you're talking about is sort of the demonstration of that freedom that comes where there's a new reality that is born. Yes. When you see life in this way. So yeah, something like The Matrix has a lot of, that's why that's also, such a classic, is so many people have found deeply Christian themes in them. Obviously, there are Buddhist allusions to that movie that people have pointed out as well, which just shows you that how open interpretation it is.
Totally. Well, and the word that goes along with freedom, I think, is the word just not bound.
Yes.
I like to think of myself as not bound by just what I see, which is
that's sort of the language Paul uses in Romans 6, right? To talk about freedom from sin. So, yes.
Love it. Anyway, as you can tell, we could go on and on and on. I really do. I do love talking about movies. I love talking about underlying meanings. And I remember going back real quick to the art gallery thing. I remember in the first half of my life, I never could understand abstract art. I just thought it was stupid. It was more concrete, which makes sense for the first half of your life. It is more concrete, and you're building your ego and all of that stuff. But I remember there was a turning point where all of a sudden, abstract art started to make more sense to me. And I think, by make sense, I mean, it just started to come into my consciousness as something I could work with and find meaning in. And anyway, so I don't know why I'm sharing that. I don't know where that leads, but there was just that turning point.
It makes me wonder if, I think almost all of us have had that instinct where you walk, and you're right. This is like when you would take them to a modern art museum when they were young. That's the first instinct is, right, I could do that, right?
Totally.
That's what everyone says. But I think there's an insecurity that we all have to work through, where for abstract art in particular, sometimes we can feel like there is one meaning that we need to know or have the answer to, that this painting is meant to be this, because we see even Impressionism, we know that is supposed to be a painting of water lilies, and we can appreciate that. We've got the answer. But you see something abstract, and until you embrace the freedom of interpretation, you're going to feel like you're being tested. And I wonder if that's part of until we move past that, we feel free to kind of be open to what it might possibly mean.
Yeah. And that just opens the doorway to so much inner searching and possible transformation, I think. So, well, I'm going to skip to one more quote in here that I think we'll close with. It says, I think you're quoting Abraham, is it Kuyper? Is that how you say his name?
Yep. Yes.
He's a Dutch theologian, and he said, God's gifts, including those of artistic talent, are lavished on all on all of humanity. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. Now, I love that quote. It's so rich, and you feel seen and embraced and held and loved all within those words. So What are your final thoughts based on that about movies as prayers?
Well, I am glad you have that response to that quote, because there could be an interpretation of it where it's triumphalist, right? Where it's that Christ is going to take over the world and do away with the unclean things. But the traditional, my background is in the Reformed tradition. And so the more traditional understanding of that is that it is a way of seeing Christ in all things.
Yes.
And not that all things are baptized, and not that we need to be discerning, that we shouldn't be discerning. Of course we should. But that because God is sovereign, Christ is over all, and this opens up the possibilities, right? Kuyper is foundational. Pretty much everything I've said or argued for has been born out of his work. Not that he, was necessarily a big fan of movies. He probably accused me of stretching things by including this. He liked high art. He was, around the turn of last century. But this idea, another idea that he wrote a lot about, was common grace. And that is that and this goes back to the filmmakers not necessarily intending these movies to be prayers, even those who may not identify as believers, God created with creative abilities, and as such can create wonderful things. Now, these are also sinful, fallen human beings, as we all are. So it gets mixed up in that. And there may be things in the art that we want to be mindful of. But God's truth can also be there.
Yeah.
And that common grace allows his truth to be found in a movie that if you might have gone to the director or the screenwriter and said, hey, I see this movie as a prayer of blank, they might tell you you're crazy. But that doesn't mean you're wrong.
Right.
So Kuyper was kind of a way of, and he's also really a guiding thinker and theologian for our work at Think Christian, where we write about all of pop culture. Our tagline is no such thing as secular, which is born out of this same idea, that we can look for God's truth as people of faith, as discerning Christians.
Of course,
we can still seek God's truth in all of these things.
Right. And then that brings up the transcendentals. Goodness, beauty, and truth can be found. Not just truth, right? Goodness and beauty as well.
Yes.
There's a couple of scriptures that come to mind in this closing. I don't know if I'm quoting it exactly right, but all things were created by him and for him and through him, right? There's that an encompassing mind. And in that common grace you're talking about, my husband and I took a walk yesterday. Of course, we were social distancing from other people, or whatever you call it, but we had to get out and breathe some air. And I was remembering that idea of common grace, actually. So I'm glad you brought that up. And we were looking up the passage, because I said, well, isn't there a scripture somewhere where, God allows the rain to fall on the good and the evil, right? It actually comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is talking about loving your enemies. And he's like, well, God allows the rain to fall on everyone. And I suppose by extension, the sun shines on everyone. So can we not at least extend that much grace to everyone? I just think that's so there's some invitations in there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Josh, this has been quite delightful.
It's been fun.
So thank you for joining me. Before we say goodbye, can you just tell us real quick, how can we find you online or on podcasts or in books? How can we connect?
Sure. Well, the book, can be found wherever you order your books. Movies Are Prayers. But my day job is as editor and host of the Think Christian podcast. So again, we write about pop culture through the lens of faith, and that's thinkchristian.net. I am on social media as Larsen on Film. So that's Twitter and Facebook. It's Larsen. If you want to connect with me there, that's always fun to meet folks that way too.
Wonderful. Well, we'll make sure to let our people know. So again, thank you so much for sharing with us today, and blessings to you as you stay healthy and safe.
Yeah, same to you, John.
So I hope you found something in our conversation about at least one way that you can enlarge yourself, realize that you can be praying more often, even in a movie theater. And remember that you can find all of Josh's links in our show notes. And I wanted to remind you, a couple weeks ago, Alan's first book, An Unhurried Life, was re-released. It's been revised and expanded. It came out on April 7th. You can get it wherever you buy books. But I wanted to tell you about the cool stuff about it. First of all, it's hardcover. It has a new cover. It has a new preface from Alan. There's a new small group guide, and there's a new appendix with ideas for ways to spend 5 unhurried minutes with God in the middle of your busy day. So go to your favorite bookseller, online or in person. You'll definitely want this updated version. And the thing we're recommending is that you purchase an extra copy for your pastor, your mentor, your coach, your spiritual director. Share the love with the leaders and the influencers in your own life. And as always, remember, we love connecting with more and more friends like you who want to rest deeper, live fuller, and lead better.